Hey good people, it's Ricky here for The Frugal Photographer, and today we have Canon's cheapest full-frame camera versus Canon's cheapest camera. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to do two pretty simple exercises. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have this very sharp Sigma f1.4 art lens on the Canon 6D versus just the kit lens on the Canon SL2. And the reason for this is that a lot of people have their basic APS-C camera with the kit lens, and they're thinking of upgrading to full frame and getting some good glass. So what's the difference between a good camera with good glass versus the cheapest camera with the cheapest lens? After that, we're going to do a Farrer test. What we're going to do is we're going to take the Canon 85 f1.8 and we're going to put that on the full frame camera, and then we're going to take the Canon 50mm f1.8 and put that on the crop sensor camera. This is going to give us extremely similar fields of view, but also they're extremely similarly sharp lenses, so that's going to give us a more fair head-to-head comparison. After those tests, I'm going to do a stress test of the Canon 6D because it has famously bad dynamic range. And in fact, every Canon camera made before 2017 has famously bad dynamic range. So you would get better dynamic range with this cheap camera than you do with an older full-frame Canon camera. So the question is, how much does that matter? How important is that to you? How significant is the difference in the dynamic range from the SL2 to the 6D? Let's find out. So now I have all these photos pulled up in Lightroom. Let's take a look. So here on the left we have the SL2, and on the right we have the 6D. So let's zoom in really far. And right here, what I'm noticing immediately, I mean obviously there's a white balance difference, but I can see some chromatic aberration on the SL2. So on the left, the SL2 is a little bit more zoomed in because 18mm on crop is a little bit more zoomed in than 24mm full frame. But I didn't want to use my wide angle lens. I specifically wanted to use the kit lens because I think that's a more interesting test to more people. So here at 1:1, I'm starting to notice a sharpness difference. But again, the equivalent of a print at 1:1 with the SL2 or the 6D is like 14 inches or something like this. Like that's a big print. It's not an insane print. Certainly people print that size all the time. But for many amateurs, it's not a likely print size. Here now we're at 1:2, and at 1:2, it is hard to notice any sharpness differences. But at 1:1, for sure, the Canon 6D with the sharp Sigma Art prime lens is destroying the SL2 with the kit lens. And then if we go 2:1, it's pretty significant. The amount of detail, even though this is smaller, I can see that the bricks look a lot sharper. The edge here looks better, not just because of chromatic aberration. If you're just a hobbyist who wants to make images that maybe you might print at 14 inches that majority of the time are going to be viewed on a computer screen, it's not just fine. I think it's really good. I am really impressed with the performance of the kit lens. But if you're a serious photographer, yes, upgrade to sharper glass. So now let's look at the test that's more fair to our crop camera. So here, we have the 50mm on the SL2 and we have the 85mm on the 6D, giving us very similar fields of view. And if we go to, let's just go to 1:1. And at 1:1, I am not noticing any differences. It's a little dark though, so let's up our exposure here. It's taking a second. There we go. So at 1:1, I am not noticing any differences. And a larger sensor camera is always technically going to be more sharp. This is just a known fact. The larger sensor is sharper, but can we actually see that it's sharper? I'm not seeing. Let's go to 2:1. And at 2:1, I am not seeing any differences in sharpness. I am seeing a difference in noise because I upped the exposure. But what's actually interesting is I'm seeing color patterns in the noise on the 6D. I did not notice that before. So in my opinion, is full frame noticeably sharper than crop? I'm just going to say no, it's not. If you want a sharp image and you want to print large, other than the fact that you can get stupidly high megapixel full frame cameras, I don't think there's an advantage with full frame. If you want a normal 24 megapixel or whatever camera, I don't think you're going to be able to see any differences in sharpness with any print size with full frame versus crop. I think the SL2 looks identically good to the full frame in terms of sharpness. Now let's do the stress test of the sensors here. So what I did is I took one exposure. It's actually much darker. Let me show you. So this is what the exposure looks like. So we have some really dark shadows and we have some really bright highlights. So first thing that I'm going to do is I am going to bring up the exposure 3 stops. And then let's take, oops, that is not what I wanted to do. And then we're going to take a look at the shadow areas. Okay, so immediately what I'm noticing is that the grain size between the SL2 and the 6D looks about the same, which is a little bit strange. It should be better on the 6D, but whatever. But I'm noticing these really apparent huge color splotches, and I'm not sure if that's hard to see on the video. So what I'm going to do is I am going to increase the clarity as well as, so I'm just going to shoot the saturation way up here and bring up the clarity. So here now it's even more obvious the difference between the SL2 and the 6D. Now this sort of pattern noise, it is a pain in the butt to edit out in Photoshop. You can do it, but it's annoying to do it. So definitely, and I can see a little bit here now that I've boosted the saturation. I couldn't see any before, but it's significantly worse on the 6D. And the other thing I can notice as well is that in the creases on the couch, I can see more detail. So the 6D not only has less color information in the shadows, it has less detail in the shadows. And this is something that's abnormal for a full frame camera. Usually a full frame camera will do significantly better than the crop sensor camera, but it's just because Canon used to be so far behind on their sensor technology, and the SL2 is one of their modern cameras from 2017 that actually has a sensor that performs fairly well relative to the competition. Not as good, but almost as good. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the exposure 3 stops, and we are going to take a look at the highlights. I'm going to pull out a little bit here to 1:1. And there's some interesting things here. So one of the things that I noticed, which was very strange to me, is that there seems to be noise in the highlights. I've never seen noise recovering highlights before, but I use cameras with higher dynamic range, so this is strange to me. But the other thing that you can notice is just that it's having a really hard time seeing these details. There's, even though the tonal variety more or less looks the same, you can see way more detail here. I was able to recover a lot more detail with the SL2 than in the 6D file, even though the light values look about the same. But then we get around here and you can see that there's a much better transition from pure white into this gray where you can start to see detail. Whereas with the 6D you have this I don't even know what to call this band here, then you have a color, and then you have another color. This is like turquoise, this is a little purple, whereas this just fades evenly, and it looks natural. Whereas with the 6D, you've got all kinds of weird colors going on and this harsh barrier. So definitely, not only does so with the exact same exposure on both cameras, it's interesting that the SL2 not only recovers the highlights better, but it recovers the shadows better. So definitely, there is a very large difference in terms of dynamic range. Now, that might be important to you, it might not, but it's important to know that by getting one of these older full-frame Canon cameras, you're giving up a lot of dynamic range that you could have with one of their newer crop sensor cameras.
Man, the manual focus on the Sigma Art lens is amazing. I could do this all day. It just feels so nice. This is amazing. I'm not giving this lens back. In conclusion, what do I think? Well, more or less I found what I was expecting. The Sigma Art prime lens on the 6D versus the kit lens on the Canon SL2, there was a fairly noticeable difference. It was pretty significant at 1:1, at 1:2. But that's the thing, is it required being at 1:1 or 1:2. So for many professionals, it's realistic that they will need to print that large. And so yeah, the kit lens on the SL2 isn't going to cut it for you. You have an obligation to your clients if you're charging a lot of money and you're printing really big. However, when we put the 85mm on the 6D and we put the 50mm on the Canon SL2, I could not distinguish a difference. They seemed pretty similar to me. Supposedly there should be a difference. The 85mm should be a fair bit sharper on the 6D than the 50mm is on the SL2. but that isn't visible to me in the real world. So to me, I would be just as happy in that situation printing a photo with the 50mm on the SL2 as with the 85mm on the 6D. And then when we did that stress test of the sensor on the 6D, we found that it was pretty noticeably worse. So to me, the difference between the dynamic range on the two cameras is larger than the difference in image quality. So for me personally, I am more interested in the dynamic range because I take a lot of shots where I find that's a large factor. A lot of people don't, and if that's the case, then there's no disadvantage to you getting the 6D. And the other thing as well is you can get around having poor dynamic range. You can take multiple shots of the same scene if you don't have a moving subject, and you can do HDR. So really, you can have a camera with quite limited dynamic range, and if you're the kind of person who does sunsets on a tripod, it doesn't matter. The 6D will do just as fine as any other camera in existence because you're creating a higher dynamic range scene in Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever tool you use. So if you are frugally minded, if you want the best performance for your dollar, I think full frame is probably not for you. That being said, there are certain photographers where for sure you should be shooting full frame. If you need low light performance, I didn't even test that because I know that the 6D blows the SL2 completely out of the water. If you want shallow depth of field, of course the 6D, the full frame camera, is going to do much better than the crop sensor camera. But that being said, I get sufficiently shallow depth of field on my crop sensor cameras. I don't feel the need for full frame so much. There's a lot of lenses for the big three brands, Sony, Canon, Nikon, where if you really want to use the lenses as intended, you should be shooting full frame. It's extremely frustrating to me that Canon is the largest camera manufacturer. APS-C is their best-selling format, and yet they have such a poor lens library for their APS-C cameras. And to be fair, it's better than it used to be. They have lots of good, sharp APS-C lenses now. But still, it's really small. If you want a collection of really good APS-C lenses, you have to shoot Fujifilm. That's basically your option. It's getting better. There's great mirrorless APS-C lenses now made by Sigma and others for like the Sony a6000 and cameras like this. But really, I feel like the primary reason for shooting full frame is to get to use a lot of great lenses the way that they were intended. And if you're into shooting wide angle and you're really serious about it and you're charging a lot of money for those landscapes or cityscapes or whatever you're charging, you probably need to be on full frame because the sharpest wide angle lenses are full frame lenses. There aren't any amazingly sharp wide angle lenses for APS-C, unfortunately. So certainly, for many photographers, full frame is the way to go, no doubt about it. However, I think for frugally minded photographers, I think probably for the majority of hobbyist photographers, going to full frame is not so much an upgrade. These days, there are many professionals moving from full frame to APS-C to Fujifilm, for example, and to even micro four thirds. And they are finding that their image quality is not significantly reduced by moving to the smaller sensor. There is a lot more to image quality than the size of your sensor, and I would say, don't worry about it. This has been Ricky for The Frugal Photographer. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.